The carved ghost. Imagine leaving your family for a few months to find supplies, but because of war, that trip stretches into 3 long years. When you finally return, desperate to embrace your wife and children, the only thing that greets you is a deathly silence. Not a soul in sight. The houses have been completely dismantled. There are no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and not a single note left behind, except for one word carved into a wooden post: CROATOAN. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. It was the real-life nightmare of John White in 1590. Over 100 people had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a riddle that humanity has failed to solve for over 4 centuries. In 1587, a group of 115 English settlers, including women and children, landed on Roanoke Island. They were hopeful pioneers seeking a new life in the Promised Land. But reality was a cruel blow. Food ran low, and relations with local tribes turned hostile. John White, the colony's governor, was forced to sail back to England for help. He left behind his wife, his daughter, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. He expected to return within months, but a war with Spain anchored him in Europe for 3 years. When White finally returned on his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, Roanoke had become a ghost city. The most bizarre twist was that single word, CROATOAN. Before leaving, White had instructed the settlers, if they had to move due to danger, carve the name of their destination on a tree, and if they were under attack, add a cross symbol. But there was no cross on that wooden post. This meant they had left voluntarily, without panic. But why would an entire community choose to vanish rather than wait for their savior? And where did they go in the vast, unforgiving wilderness? For centuries, theories ran wild: massacres, plagues, or even alien abductions. But modern archaeology is pulling back the curtain on a much more grounded reality. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, now Hatteras Island, and the tribe that lived there. Scientists now believe that instead of starving, the settlers made a brilliant survival choice. They assimilated. They abandoned their English identity to join the local tribes. Recently, archaeologists have found English pottery, gold rings, and lead tools at sites belonging to indigenous peoples. DNA studies on descendants of these tribes have even shown traces of European ancestry. It seems the Roanoke colony didn't disappear. They simply melted into the heart of ancient America, choosing to change their names and lifestyles for a chance at a future. The Frankenstein fossil. What if the most important discovery in the history of human evolution, something you've believed and taught your children for 40 years, was actually just a cheap toy? In 1912, the world was rocked by a fossil named Piltdown Man, hailed as the missing link between apes and humans. It was displayed with dignity in museums as a monument of knowledge, but behind the glass lay a humiliating truth. In the early 20th century, scientists were desperate for evidence of Darwin's theory of evolution. They craved a half-human, half-ape creature to prove our origins. Right on cue, Charles Dawson, a lawyer and amateur archaeologist, claimed to have found strange skull fragments in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England. With a human-like cranium and an ape-like jaw, Piltdown Man was instantly crowned as the common ancestor of mankind. Britain proudly declared, the first human was British, but this ancestor was a literal Frankenstein's monster. The horrifying twist came in 1953, when new forensic technologies were applied. Scientists realized the skull was actually from a medieval human, while the jaw belonged to an orangutan. The culprit had been incredibly meticulous. He used iron solutions and acid to stain the bones, making them look millions of years old. The ape teeth had been filed down to mimic human wear patterns. For half a century, the scientific elite had worshipped a pile of scrap that a modern microscope could have unmasked in seconds. Why were the world's greatest minds fooled for so long? The answer lies in the trap of belief. At the time, British scientists were eager to find a great ancestor on their own soil to compete with discoveries in Germany and France. They saw only what they wanted to see. When evidence perfectly matched their hypothesis, they stopped asking questions. Piltdown Man is a painful lesson in confirmation bias. However, the miracle of science is its ability to self-correct. It wasn't a prophet or a supernatural force, but the objective scientific method, skepticism and chemical testing, that finally stripped away the mask. Science may wander down the wrong path, but it always finds its way back to the truth. The thief of voices. Words can be a healing balm, but they can also be a slow poison, that destroys the soul from within. In 1939, a prestigious professor at the University of Iowa conducted a secret experiment that would later be branded the monster study. He didn't use scalpels or toxins. He used only one thing: criticism. His goal was to cure stuttering, but the result was a psychological massacre that turned innocent children into ghosts who were terrified of their own voices. Wendell Johnson was a leading expert in speech pathology, and he was haunted by his own stutter. At the time, medicine believed stuttering was an innate biological defect. But Johnson had a different theory. He believed children started stuttering only because adults labeled them as stutterers. He hypothesized that if you constantly told a child they were speaking incorrectly, their brain would short-circuit from anxiety and actually create a stutter. To prove he was right, Johnson conducted a ruthless gamble on 22 defenseless orphans. Johnson and his associate Mary Tudor divided the children into two groups. The first was praised and encouraged, but the terrifying twist lay in the second group, children who were perfectly healthy and fluent speakers. Mary Tudor bombarded them with vicious criticism. She told these 5- and 6-year-olds, "You're starting to stutter, and don't open your mouth unless you can say it right." The result wasn't a scientific breakthrough, it was a psychological tragedy. The once fluent children became terrified of communicating. They didn't develop a mechanical stutter, but they became mute, withdrawn, and consumed by anxiety. Their voices weren't broken by muscle, they were strangled by fear. Why was this called the monster study? Because even when Johnson realized he was destroying the children's futures, he didn't stop. Imagine Mary Tudor's words as heavy bricks building a mental prison around these kids. They began to refuse to answer questions in class, hanging their heads and covering their mouths whenever they had to speak. These psychological scars lasted until they were in their 70s and 80s. Even worse, after World War II ended and the world recoiled at the brutal Nazi experiments, Johnson feared for his reputation and sealed the results. The truth only emerged in 2001. Science had performed a silent crime in the name of truth, turning orphans into leftovers of scientific hubris. The deadly high. At 8,848 meters, the air is so thin your brain begins to eat itself. Your neurons die off, and your consciousness becomes as blurred as if you just downed a bottle of hard liquor. Scientists call this the death zone, a place where the human body cannot survive for more than a few hours. But on May 10, 1996, a group of the world's most experienced climbers did the unthinkable. They saw the monster storm approaching. They knew their oxygen was failing, yet they refused to turn back. Why did the smartest minds choose to walk straight into the jaws of death? Conquering Everest is the ultimate dream, a symbol of human endurance. By the 90s, climbing Everest had become a $65,000 luxury service. Two legends in the mountaineering world, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, led two expeditions with one golden rule, the 2 p.m. rule. If you haven't reached the summit by 2 p.m., you must turn back, even if you are only 1 meter away. This wasn't a suggestion, it was the contract that kept you alive. But on that fateful day, the golden rule was tossed into the blizzard. The cruel twist was that the violators weren't naive amateurs, they were the masters themselves. Instead of turning back at 2 o'clock, they crawled through deep snow until 3 o'clock, or even 4 p.m. Why did the most rational minds become so blind? The answer wasn't the storm, it was a psychological virus called summit fever. When the greatest goal of your life is within arm's reach, the human brain becomes a computer with a fried processor, completely losing the ability to calculate risk. By the time the last climbers touched the summit, the sun was setting, and the worst blizzard of the decade struck. Imagine these climbers as phones with 1% battery left. They had no strength to descend in pitch darkness and ponce 50°C temperatures. Hypoxia stripped them of sound judgment. Some sat down to rest and never stood up again. Others saw hallucinations and stepped into the abyss. The most heartbreaking story was that of Rob Hall. He was trapped near the summit and couldn't get down. In his final hours, he was patched through via satellite to speak to his pregnant wife back home. His last words, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." 8 people died within 24 hours. They traded their lives for a few minutes on top of the world, a heavy price for a fleeting title. The Forest Boy. On a winter morning in 1797, a strange creature stepped out from the edge of the Aveyron forest in France. It was naked, its body covered in scars, walking on all fours and growling like a wolf. But upon closer inspection, the villagers realized with horror it wasn't a wild beast, but a boy of about 12. He had lived alone in the deep woods for years, without clothes, without language, and without a single sign of civilization. The appearance of Victor sent a shockwave through the scientific circles of Paris. At the time, thinkers believed in the theory of the tabula rasa, the idea that humans are born as a blank slate, and education can write anything upon it. Philosophers and doctors eagerly awaited Victor, believing he was the pure human of nature. They expected that in a few months of teaching, Victor would tell them the secrets of the wild and prove the greatness of human intellect. But reality slapped the arrogance of science in the face. A young doctor, Jean-Marc Itard, adopted Victor and spent 5 years trying to make him human. The cruel twist? Victor's brain wasn't a blank slate. It was like a clock with jammed gears. Victor could withstand freezing temperatures without shivering. He could hear a chestnut fall but completely ignore a gunshot fired next to his ear. He lived in a different reality, where his senses only reacted to survival. Itard realized that what we call human nature, language, empathy, social bonds, are actually gifts with an expiration date. Why couldn't an intelligent child learn to speak? Victor's story helped science discover the critical periods of the brain. Imagine the infant brain as soft clay that freezes and hardens after a certain age. Because Victor lived in isolation for too long without hearing human speech, the neural pathways responsible for language had been abandoned and died off. Despite Itard's best efforts, Victor only ever learned 2 words: milk, late, and oh God, oh Dieu. He could learn to wear clothes and set a table, but his soul remained forever trapped at the edge of the forest. Victor became an alien on his own planet, an entity existing in the gray zone between man and beast, belonging to neither. The loneliest island. Do you know there's a place on Earth where the astronauts on the International Space Station are actually closer to humanity than you are? Welcome to Tristan da Cunha, a tiny dot sitting right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. To get here, you can't buy a plane ticket. There is no airport. The only way is a 6-day voyage by sea from South Africa. This place is 2,400 kilometers away from the nearest inhabited island. If you have appendicitis or need a package from Amazon, the only answer is wait a few months. But the strangest thing isn't its distance. It's that the 250 residents were once evacuated to paradise in London, only to collectively demand a return to their stone prison in the sea. We live in a world of instant connection. We fear isolation and view being cut off from society as a punishment. For most, a day without internet is a disaster. We believe happiness lies in convenience, in the bright lights of the city, and endless opportunity. Tristan da Cunha is, theoretically, a modern nightmare, a barren volcanic island where storms howl year-round and the world has seemingly forgotten your existence. But in 1961, a twist of fate tested their loyalty. A volcano on the island erupted, forcing the entire community to evacuate to the UK. They were given modern homes, TVs, supermarkets, and the world's best hospitals. The world believed they would never go back to that harsh rock. But after 2 years, a vote was held, and the results stunned Britain. Nearly everyone chose to leave the luxury of London to return to their volcano. They preferred to face boulders and crashing waves over a society they called cold and full of division. Isolation forged a community unlike any other. On Tristan da Cunha, all land is communal property. There are no rich, no poor, and most importantly, no crime. Their life is like a 19th century time loop. Because there are only about 7 or 8 surnames on the whole island, everyone is family. This genetic bottleneck has left scars like high rates of asthma, but it also created an invisible bond so strong nothing can break it. They survive by fishing for lobster and growing potatoes in patches shielded by stone walls against the sea spray. When a supply ship docks, only a few times a year, the whole island turns into a festival. They don't need police, because the judgment of your neighbor is the heaviest sentence. For the residents of Tristan, isolation isn't a cage, it's a shield, protecting them from the chaos and selfishness of the outside world. Tristan da Cunha is a profound lesson on the meaning of freedom. It proves that humans don't need everything to be happy. We only need a place to belong and people who truly care. It leaves us with a haunting question. In our modern world, where we have thousands of friends on social media but don't know our neighbor's name, are we lonelier than the people on the most isolated island on Earth? The world is still full of hidden truths and stories that defy belief. If you're ready to uncover more of the most incredible and disturbing mysteries of our history, subscribe to Oddplain. Don't let the next story pass you by. Join us, and let's explore the unknown together. Thank you for watching, and stay curious. Goodbye.